So I'll start like I generally like to start any conversation. I'll start with a story. So picture this, if you will, a dynamic, small but dynamic and thriving economy. This is a real life story, by the way. In the early 2000s, very eager to provide services and infrastructure development for its people, decided that it was a good idea to go a-borrowing. And so they were issuing bonds, taking out loans, from the very eager international capital markets. So year after year, the debts piled up, and unfortunately, there were no legal guardrails to check how much is being borrowed, for what purpose is the borrowed amount being used for, and so on. Unfortunately, after a few years, revenue projections failed, the bills came due, and this island country could not pay. I'm sure that's a narrative too many of us are perhaps familiar with. And so almost overnight, this small island economy was cast into one of the largest public bankruptcies that we've seen in the 20th century. Billions of dollars were defaulted in debts. Credit rating, as you might imagine, fell. And there were savage cuts to public services, which unfortunately and expectedly led to a humanitarian crisis. Well, like I said, this is not fiction. This was Puerto Rico. Similar lines of story also can be attributed to Iceland in 2008 and Greece in 2003, 4, and 5. So it wasn't just that they had excessive debts. It was that there was a failure of legal, institutional, and regulatory systems to check these debts that they were accumulating. And let me pause here to underline the very crucial points with all of the clarity I can summon. Legal frameworks are profoundly relevant, but they don't act in isolation. They require the steady hand of enforcement and systems that work. So if there's no legal and regulatory framework, well, first of all, there's no bedrock. There's no framework to rely to enforce anything. But at the same time, the fact that laws are sometimes flouted by political appointees in Africa does not in any way mean that laws should be minimized, rejected, or undermined. And so I know there may be questions around, we have laws, but they are not working. It's true to an extent. But you see, the truth about laws is that, after all, it's just a machinery of accountability. At its best, a law would store or would be a bulwark against reckless economic behavior. And at its worst, laws at least provide a benchmark for acceptable conduct. And that's important. And so we will focus especially on African countries and what's going on with our legal and institutional frameworks, and then we'll draw on global examples to see how things obtain elsewhere. And so on that basis, I'll spend the next hopefully 1 hour, 10 minutes to run through these slides. And as I said, I do expect to hear, is Gambia in the house? What do you think? Every so often. Because I think it's important that we share our experiences. I have the slides on my phone. I typically don't like to talk at you, so I like to be around the audience. And so I could just, while I'm changing the slides on the, actually I don't have a microphone. Oh, there's a microphone. Hello, great. So I can move around and change the slides from my hand here. And let's see how this can work. So first we have, I think this is probably, we have why legal frameworks matter. And the first thing is that legal underpinnings are crucial. because public debt management relies on robust legal frameworks, etc., etc. These four reasons, or these two reasons, are the key points on why we need adequate legal frameworks. It is that if a public debt framework is going to thrive, there needs to be a system of laws in place and regulations in place and institutions in place that foster the workability of the framework. And so we are looking at sovereign debt crisis from Latin America, Europe to Africa, and we'll focus on how laws shape PDM and drawing on African experiences. This is the first introduction. I think I already addressed this. Okay, so legal frameworks simply are the laws that underpin, not just the laws, but also the regulations that govern and underpin public debt management. And we know that there's generally two areas when we are looking at the categorization of how legal frameworks function. There is the area of public law, and there is also private law. Now, public law, and we will dwell on this for a bit, are the laws and the systems that a government promulgates to regulate anything, quite frankly, but in this case, debts in this country. And so public law, goes from the Constitution, which is the ground norm, which is the major law of a country, and every other law derives from the Constitution. And then we have acts of parliament, we have secondary legislations like directives of ministers that sort of confirm how administration should be done for public debts. And we have, to some extent, soft law. I think that's on the screen as well. So together they empower a government on how to borrow, when to borrow, for what reasons to borrow. And this is extremely important, as we will see in the next few slides. And also there's private law. You see, when your government takes out a loan in the first instance, or a bond indenture, it's entering into a private contract. Now, this contract determines what happens or defines the relationship more clearly between the government and the lender or the creditor. And so, in its own way, private law or contract law also identify and streamline how law or public debt, is administered in a country. What we find is that there's blurred lines between public law and private law. So public law are the laws, the Constitution, the parliamentarian acts, the bylaws, the directives of ministry, etc., that govern how debt should be accumulated and managed. Private law are the individual documents that transfer debt and that regulate how debt is managed. But the very power to enter into a private contract, the very ability of a sovereign to issue a bond indenture is embossed in a law that is embossed, or should be embossed at least, in a law that confers that authority and that power. Far often, as I'm sure some of us can relate to this, there are countries that take out loans, and I think we heard from someone yesterday, take out a loan without the law, or against the law, or in excess of the law. And in that case, in law, we say the person has acted, or the government has acted ultra vires, beyond the power of his limits, or beyond the limits, my apologies, of his power. And so these two typically interweave. So there are key components of a public debt legal framework. And when we talk about key components, we're looking at how are these public debts laws encapsulated within the wider or broader legal framework of a sovereign. First, we have constitutional provisions. And, it's my recommendation every time, to the extent that there is debt prescribed by the Constitution, that's best practice. Because the Constitution is what we call in law the ground norm, or the ground law. It's the law from which every other law derives validity. And so if the Constitution, for instance, determines what law or what policies is permissible for debt, it's easy then for you to have a stronger basis to challenge inappropriate debt practices by governments. And Zambia, I think it's Article 207, look, is there. Zambia has a provision, same with Cabo Verde, by the way, and there are a few countries on the continent and a lot of countries outside the continent that have debt provisions in their constitution. But this is not the only way by which you can regulate debt, of course. You have primary legislations. We have public debt management acts. We have that in Sierra Leone, for instance. We have fiscal responsibility acts that determine how debt is controlled, managed, and used. We have Ghana Loans Act. Ghana is here, aren't they? And they're a very good example. Now, we'll come back to Ghana a couple of times. We have Ghana Loans Act that determines how loans are disbursed, are used, and how they can even come to place in the first instance. And then we have Mauritius, a very good example as well, and we'll come back to Mauritius later. They have a Public Debt Management Act. Now, all of these are just sources of primary law that are just under the Constitution. Because again, like I mentioned earlier, the Constitution is the ground norm, so every law flows from the Constitution. And then we have secondary legislation like the power of the minister, for instance, to prescribe regulations and directives on how debt can be accumulated and managed. Let me flip to the next slide. So yeah, so that's secondary legislation, so that's the regulations and rules. Then we have policy and soft law. So sometimes your primary legislation, your acts of parliament can determine that you must, for instance, have a medium-term debt strategy document every year or every 5 years or every 3 years as you know, is determined by the sovereign. And this is not law itself, but it's what lawyers like to call soft law. It's soft law because it does not have the kind of binding force of what we then call hard law. Hard law being the Constitution, the primary legislation, and to a lesser degree, the secondary regulations. So we have MTDS, I already talked about that. Then Aphrodite has a very excellent borrowing charter that describes how borrowing should be done. Unfortunately, these are not always binding, but they are very helpful guides. So when the government has an MTDS in place, it's not, you can't sue the government for not following the MTDS, for instance, but it's a very important guide in order to manage debt sustainably. And you'll see that the IMF, for instance, or the World Bank will typically, we'll get to this point later, will typically request that countries who don't have MTDS or annual borrowing plans, etc., should have those in place. Gambia, I'm sure, has very good experience with this. I wonder if anyone, say someone from Burundi, can tell us what you think is a good reason why we should have debt laws. And I will go back so that you don't look at the screen.
Merci pour la parole. Je tiens à signaler qu'au Burundi, le cadre légal a été renforcé dans le cadre de renforcer la gestion des finances publiques. Il y a une loi d'endettement qui a été adoptée en 2024. Il y a aussi une stratégie de la dette à court et moyen terme qui existe. Nous venons dernièrement d'avoir un manuel de procédure de gestion de la dette. Tous ces éléments, donc tous ces documents, il s'agit donc il y a aussi un comité technique de gestion de la dette qui a été mis en place par arrêté du Premier ministre. Tous ces éléments, il s'agit donc d'un cadre légal qui est en train d'être renforcé pour tendre à une gestion moderne de la dette suivant les standards internationaux. C'est ça ce que je voudrais dire. Merci.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful and it's good to know. What we are curious about is why do you think that move by the country, by the minister, to initiate this public debt law is important?
Bon, c'est très important de mettre en place tous ces textes réglementaires parce que ça donne donc un cadre légal, donner donc des orientations de la manière dont on doit s'endetter. Et aussi, pour tous ces aspects de manuel de procédure, c'est le tracé de manière écrite, comment donc l'endettement doit être réalisé. Donc, tous ces arsenals juridiques qui montrent comment on doit procéder à l'endettement et aussi tous ces textes qui doivent être respectés. Merci.
That is excellent. And that speaks to one of the points that we have here, as you see, on the screen. Why? Governance, you said. And in other words, you can say it promotes fiscal discipline. It determines how much can be borrowed, when, and for what purpose. And that's why we have, for example, if the law sets a debt ceiling that requires parliamentary approval, it is a speed bump against runaway borrowing. The president or anyone in the country, any political actor, would be sure that if they go acquire debts without parliamentary approval, they are going against the law. Now, how to enforce that is a separate determination, but at least it is settled that there is a law that prohibits runaway borrowing. And you see that often, during elections. Governments tend to ramp up debts because they are trying to maybe win an election and they need money at all costs. And then they could go borrowing. Now, if you have a balanced parliamentary system that is effective, they can be a stopgate for any kind of borrowing that they do not approve. I know that what we find in many countries is that they have parliaments that actually, unfortunately, because of politics, just approve any debts that the executive wants. So that's a separate determination. Again, at the beginning, we established that laws by themselves are not sufficient without the systems. If you have a law criminalizing murder and you don't have prison systems, you've done nothing. And so the systems are very important, and that's why we're going slowly on this wise. Also, transparency and accountability is a very important component on why we need strong legal frameworks, not just the legal ones, but also the institutional frameworks, because there are certain countries now that have strict requirements on publishing debts. And if there's a country here where your laws, either your primary, secondary, or subsidiary laws, do not have provisions for debt reporting, that is something to take home today to try to insist on as a government official. And then, obviously, investors are looking at the numbers. I'll give you an example. And so, Japan, for instance, my last finding was that Japan's debt to GDP rating is almost similar to many African countries, and probably even worse. Probably worse. And only because a lot of Japan's borrowing is domestic, and they borrow a lot from their domestic markets. But guess what? If Japan goes to the market with another country of similar fundamentals that is probably in Latin America or in Africa, there's a chance that Japan would have a better deal than that African country. Because guess what? Your investors and creditors are looking at beyond your debt to GDP ratio, and that's important. But you're also looking at your institutional infrastructure. You're looking at your legal framework. You're looking at how transparent your policies are. Nigeria is a good example. There are a couple of good examples in the country, in the continent, but Nigeria is a good example of a country that publishes its debt. If you go to the Nigerian Debt Management Office website, for instance, you would see every single line item is published there. The same thing with Ghana to a large extent. And so investors are looking at this. Credit rating agencies are looking at this. We witnessed a very interesting, as some might like to call it, paradox in the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks, where the same credit rating organization that's downgraded Afreximbank improved Ghana. And they cited reasons like improved monetary system within the monetary policies, improvement of the CD, of the currency, the restructuring that is ongoing and how far-reaching that restructuring has been. I mean, all of these factors that this organization gave on their own are good. They are good indicators of why the credit rating of Ghana should improve. But I guess when you look at it in parallel with what they've done with Afreximbank, you begin to ask questions. But the point I'm making here is not to cast aspersions on the credit rating agency, but to say that fundamentals matter and that the world, both creditors and the credit rating agencies are watching. I gave a case in point, the HIPIC initiative lessons. And so we see that after HIPIC, I think I made this point yesterday as well, when countries that inculcated sound debt fundamentals were able to tide over at least better than countries that did not after HIPIC. So debt relief is not the solution to anything without structural and appropriate legal frameworks. So what are the key elements of a sound debt legal framework? The first is a clear mandate to borrow. It's extremely important that your debt laws, whether it be the constitution or the primary laws or the secondary laws, clearly articulate who can borrow. Some countries have laws that say only the presidents can initiate a borrowing, subject to parliamentary approval. Some countries would say only the Minister of Finance or the Minister of Finance and the President can initiate borrowing subject to approval. If your borrowing powers have no checks, have no clear mandate on who has the right to borrow, that's problematic and is something to be noted. Another key element is borrowing purposes and limits. And so debt should be for specified purposes. I heard a comment yesterday, I forget from whom, but he made a very brilliant point that we should begin to focus debts on capital projects and not on recurrent expenditure. And you see this in Section 7 of the Nigerian Fiscal Responsibility Act, for instance. It bars any borrowing that is not capital expenditure or refinancing purposes or human development. And then if it's for recurring expenditure, for instance, or recurrent expenditure, you can't borrow for that purpose. And it makes sense. And so your debt law should have purposes, but also limits. And so you see certain countries have ceilings on how much can be borrowed. And we've seen countries within the SADC region, the South African region, within the EAC, East African Community region, but more poignantly within the West African Economic Monetary Union and the CEMAC, the Central and Eastern African Monetary Union. These latter unions have strong binding thresholds on how much their member countries should be able to exceed or be below in their debt accumulation. So it's important to have ceilings. And also define roles and responsibilities. What we see and what's best practice is that different countries should have a standalone debt management office. And we are seeing that increasingly on the continent, and that's incredible, where we are having, I know that in the Gambia we have the Debts and Loans Directorate. In Sierra Leone we have the Public Debt Management Division, I believe. In Ghana we have the Ghana Debt Management Division as well. And throughout our countries we're seeing a rapid increase in a standalone, Zambia has the same thing, a standalone debt management office. That's extremely important. But even more important is that beyond the debt management office, we need to ensure that these offices have delineated and clear responsibilities, and to the extent possible that they are autonomous or perhaps semi-autonomous, so that they are not able to run off on their own, but also they have checks and balances. They're reporting to Parliament before they make critical nation-impacting decisions. Does anyone have any concern with this so far? So good. All is very clear. I like it. So we talked about transparency previously. It's a key point of how you can determine if your debt management framework is indeed strong. Is anyone willing to share if their country has a debt limit that they abide by? Okay, you know what? Let's leave enforcement aside. You have a debt ceiling of how much, in theory, your country is supposed to incur in debts yearly. Is anyone willing to share? Okay, regardless, it's worthy to note that even if we're not saying it, most of our countries have debt ceilings in their laws, and that's remarkable. That's important enough. Then there's this important point I need to flag, although we'll get deeper into it later, and that's strong controls on guarantees and contingent liabilities. Oftentimes, you see, the thing with contingent liabilities is that they are like, I hate to use this children analogy, but it's like peekaboo. You know, they're hiding their face, and they're just there, waiting for the opportune moment to show up. And that's what happens with a lot of our public-private partnership agreements. So governments typically go on and guarantee these agreements, or beyond even the public. We'll get to this point much later. But the point is, contingent liabilities need to have caps on them. We need to have clear controls on what can constitute contingent liability, when should and when must the government come in for a contingent liability. So clear definitions are very important to be made on this point in your debt laws. And so combining all of these, a strong public debt management law emphasizes who can borrow, why they can borrow, how they can borrow, what level and detail of transparency, and what debt limits they have. And I had this interaction here for the audience. Just think about this. Is your country's framework reflecting all, or at least most of some of these principles? It's worthy to note. And I know that it's easy to say, oh, we're not lawyers, but I think if you're working in the Ministry of Finance, you're holding such a strong burden, or the central bank, or the financial aspect of the country, it's very important that you have some grasp on the laws that underpin your parastatal. So I mentioned I was going to get to the real-world examples that are really good for us to think about and see how we can incorporate some of their practices. I don't think that any of these countries are represented here in their capacity as a member. So I would speak to them as opposed to asking someone to speak about them. So first we have Mauritius is a very brilliant example because they have such a comprehensive, one of the most comprehensive in the world actually, public debt management law. And this law, apart from it being comprehensive in that it covers both the federal loans or federal debt exposure and local government debt exposure, and which is something that not every African country has. And also on guarantees, Mauritius restricts them. So the government can't take a loan for current or operational expenses. We made this point earlier. The law requires the Ministry of Finance to publish an MTDS, I think it's on a quarterly basis or on a yearly basis, and then to provide a debt status to the country on a quarterly basis. And that's something to think about, because the world is moving towards a debt practice or debt expectation of transparency. The more transparent your country is, the more confident investors generally just feel. We talked about Nigeria earlier, but the Fiscal Responsibility Act is also an exemplary document, and it indicates debt limits. It's already there on the screen. So all government borrowing, both federal and state, are under the debt limits. Nigeria has a very interesting feature in its FRA, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and it effectively commandeers local banks to ensure that a sub-national government, a state government, adheres to the debt limits for that state or for the country before incurring additional loans. And it's a very important and interesting enforcement mechanism. To what extent is it being enforced? That's an open question. New Zealand, let's go to a global example. And so we see here New Zealand, it provides a permanent legislative authority for the incurring of debts. And so at all levels, Parliament must approve any debt to be incurred in New Zealand. That's on the screen there, I believe. Yeah, I shouldn't just read through. I think the slides will be hopefully provided to all of us so that we can move on from this point. At the regional level, I already made a brief segue to what we have on the WAEMU, that's the West African Economic Monetary Union, and the fact that they have, I believe it's 50, is it 50? 70% of GDP is a threshold for how much a country's debt exposure should be in comparison to GDP levels. CEMAC has a similar provision, I believe there has a 60%. SADC, and again, don't forget that both CEMAC and WAEMU are compulsory or are binding. Sorry, I didn't change the screen. Yes, are binding, but the one for SADC and EAC are not binding, and so to that extent, at best a gentleman's agreements between countries. Sorry, I have other notable mentions here. South Africa's legal framework as well. South Africa does not from research, and if anyone knows better, let me know. But from research, South Africa doesn't have necessarily a single legal framework for debt. But the country has a Public Finance Management Act and different subsidiary laws that integrate some of the best practices in debt management within the country. Another good example is Rwanda as well. The slides will be passed. So I want us to segue from this point and talk about contingent liabilities. And it's very important because, like I said, they're like peekaboo. And if I may demonstrate, this is how contingent debts show up generally. You'll see me 1 second. Or actually, as a matter of fact, actually, this is what it looks like. And then doing a restructuring, it comes out like this. And then you're wondering, oh no, it's a hidden loan, it's a hidden debt. We didn't know about it. Yes, that's how they function. And the reason why they're this problematic is because they are usually, so we have two types, explicit and implicit. The problematic ones are the implicit ones. But the explicit ones generally are the ones where the government enters the contractual agreements and explicitly says, we guarantee, we issue a sovereign guarantee for this debt, for this bond, for this loan. And so in that case, clearly within the books, I believe it's recorded that there is a guarantee inherent in favor of the government. Where we have concerns is the implicit contingent liability. And so they result from what we consider to be the political economy of the sovereign. A good example is the National Insurance Deposits Corporation of many countries. The government considers this, or it's considered that this particular corporation cannot fail. And so whenever they have insolvency concerns, the expectation is for the government to step in and salvage them. Another implicit sort of contingent liability, as it may be put, is pandemics, for instance. So when the world fell into the ugly hands of COVID-19, government didn't need to plan an MTDS 5 years ago anticipating COVID. They had to step in, provide for some countries what we call palliatives. They had to ramp up spending in healthcare. That is contingent on the government's existence as a political, economic sovereign. They didn't plan for this, but it's implicit in their existence. We also have arbitral awards. And so the government may have entered contracts or bilateral investment treaties and are having a jolly good moment just establishing infrastructure in their country. And tomorrow, some investor, some company goes to sue them or goes to initiate arbitral proceedings in London and then, get an award from that, comes back to the country, say we are here to enforce an award of 1 billion USD. I believe the biggest claim of an arbitral award so far has been a claim of 100 billion US dollars. Obviously, it was not granted, but I think what we've seen in practice is that an arbitral tribunal has awarded in favor of a country, I believe it's between 5 and 9 billion against the country. So imagine that a government is having a swell day, and then it finds out that it has 9 billion debt to pay somewhere, just because a country sued or an investor sued under a bilateral investment treaty. So these are some of the concerns with how debt can ramp up and why it's important to have a framework that clearly defines the scope of contingent liability and how it inheres on the government. And so I noted here that contingent liabilities could be systemic or subnational. So it could be for banks, for instance, that the government deems too important to fail. We saw that in the US, for instance, when Silicon Valley Bank failed 2 years ago, and the US effectively had to jump in to salvage the investments of its customers. And subnationals as well, when state government, for countries who have a presidential or a federal system of governments, or a system of government that allows for subnational governments, we see that sometimes when state governments enter into agreements where they are unable to meet their obligations, it could revert back to the federal government to settle the scores of that state government. So these are some of the concerns with contingent liabilities. So I put general examples here. And so I noted here, and I want to read out what a strong legal frameworks that underpins contingent liabilities should look like. The first is caps and limits. And so laws can aggregate a limit on outstanding guarantees. And so it's a thing where if the law says certain things and has been put in place, not retroactively, right, but when a government has proactively determined to put a regulation on contingent liabilities, it is a fair and strong argument to say, based on our laws, it is illegal for us to make this payment or make this move. The problem arises when you try to do that retroactively. So caps and limits. So another point is approval process. So generally, it's important that Parliament should approve or at least be informed of any contingent liability. Again, this tails back to the question of transparency. The reality is, these are systems that can be employed. To the extent that they are not employed, we will continue to have debt bottlenecks on the continent. But what we are trying to achieve here is show you best practices and what can be done to help governments manage debt sustainably from a legal and institutional standpoint. Also, this best practices risk assessment. I don't know if it's on the So mandate risk assessment before issuing a guarantee. It's extremely important. Australia is a good example where they insist that before any guarantee inheres in favor of the government, a risk assessment by an independent third party is undertaken. And that's perhaps a good example for African countries to follow. One good practice is also provisioning. And by provisioning, I mean it is not uncommon. We see this in some advanced climes and some best practices where generally every year in the budget, a certain percentage of the budget is allocated to contingent liabilities. It's what we can call the just-in-case budgetary allocation, just in case, right? And then the last point is transparency, but that's already been overflogged. I really want to get the audience to engage at this point. First, I would ask kindly if anyone has or feels the need to explain to us if they've ever been caught, if their countries have ever been caught by a surprise contingent liability. Say, for example, in a restructuring, and then when you're trying to close your financing gap, and then you hear that, oh, there's actually a contingent liability somewhere that you have to deal with. Is there any country that's been in that situation, and how did you deal with it? And feel free to redact information. I don't need to know, we don't need to know the names. Okay, there's a hand here, please.
Okay. Allô?
Yeah.
Okay. Merci bien au présentateur pour sa présentation. Je me nomme Siri Youssouf, je suis du Burkina Faso. Il faut dire qu'à notre niveau, effectivement, on a des dispositions législatives et réglementaires également qui encadrent la dette. À notre niveau, il y a un plafond de garantie qui est indiqué dans la loi des finances de chaque année. Et également, il faut dire que dans la réglementation, les rôles des différents acteurs, à chaque niveau, effectivement, la mobilisation des emprunts est indiquée pour les différents types d'emprunts également. Et chaque année, nous avons également une stratégie de gestion de la dette qui est élaborée, une stratégie triennale, stratégie de gestion de la dette à moyen terme, qui fixe chaque année le plafond d'endettement, base décaissement, qui est prévu dans la loi des finances, qui est annexé également à la loi des finances. Voilà, pour que, effectivement, on puisse prévoir dans le budget effectivement les engagements de l'État en termes de remboursement pour les décaissements qui seront faits effectivement sur les différents emprunts. Parce qu'on peut signer une convention cette année, mais le décaissement effectivement peut se faire plus tard. Et la plupart du temps, les remboursements sont axés sur les décaissements. Voilà. Donc, il faut dire qu'à notre niveau, c'est réglementé et chaque année, c'est suivi. Et la réglementation également précise le rôle des différents acteurs, que ce soit les acteurs qui interviennent au niveau juridictionnel, le Conseil constitutionnel, notamment pour s'assurer de la conformité effectivement de l'accord par rapport à la Constitution. Voilà, parce que la Constitution indique dans certains cas, effectivement, où on ne peut pas, comment on appelle, il y a des aspects qui font l'objet de limitations et la Constitution indique également les emprunts qui doivent faire l'objet de ratification. Voilà. Donc, par conséquent, l'article 149 de la Constitution chez nous indique clairement, effectivement, que les engagements et les engagements qui ont un impact sur le budget doivent faire l'objet impérativement de ratification. Donc, à notre niveau, vraiment, on a une réglementation depuis les lois, les décrets, les arrêtés qui encadrent le processus. Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Youssef, and that's very helpful. So what Mr. Youssef has said in brief is they have a very strong legal framework in Burkina Faso, and that's helpful. And he did mention a very important point that draws to the question I asked, which is, have you been caught by any surprise? And he did mention that they have a debt ceiling or a guarantee ceiling under their laws. But I wonder if there's a country here that has had to restructure or undertake a liability management scheme where they discovered that there were contingent liabilities that they just didn't know about on the surface until they began their restructuring or liability management.
Pose the question. I'm Matthew Sandi again, Director of Public Debt Management in the Ministry of Finance, Government of Sierra Leone. We didn't have a contingent liability, as you are saying, in terms of shock, but we had an arrears that emanated from previous fiscal operations that were not reported for about a decade. So what we did was to subject those to audit by the Supreme Audit Institution, and then they produced a report. So our rough estimate was around $300 million of debt. $320 million of debt was added to the domestic debt stock. So that was the only surprise. And how we managed that was to prepare an arrears clearance strategy on how to manage that and to propose haircuts, which we've tried to implement, but the suppliers, because of the audit verification, resisted, so we had to redo a second strategy. At that time, the real value of most of these arrears had actually declined because of inflation, so we are now paying them down gradually. So that is the only surprise. In terms of one way to address as you mentioned, the contingent liabilities is to promote transparency, in particular for state-owned enterprise debt. And we shared our experience at the IMF annual debt transparency conference this year, where we were identified for good practice in publishing SOE debt. So how we did that was we started with 5 state-owned enterprise debts. We expanded to 10, and now we are publishing all.
Amazing.
On our website. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that's good practice that we've just also talked about. We've seen it in practice where there are governments they've been surprised, and after surprise, how they say, once bitten, twice shy. You've been surprised, you take steps to stop future surprises. But also, what we are also trying to establish in this conversation is that you can quell that surprise. You don't have to be surprised. And that's the point. Thank you so much to gentlemen from Sierra Leone and gentlemen from Burkina Faso. I note your hand from Sudan, and South Sudan, and I will come to it, please. Thank you. So far, as you would notice, we've been talking about public laws and how laws can govern debt management and accumulation. Remember that private law or contracts also invariably affects and determine how debt is accumulated and managed. Remember also that every law that empowers the government to borrow also empowers the government to enter into an agreement, because borrowing is done primarily 2 ways. either by bond indenture or by loan agreements. And then there are varying other types of borrowing that flow quite necessarily from these two broad categories. And so if it's by an agreement or an indenture, there are a few clauses that as employees or government officials it's necessary to be aware of. I just want to make a point that I think is very important. It may look like, oh, this is just for the lawyers. I don't need to know all of this legal frameworks thing. But I want to emphasize that sophisticated countries who deal with debts, or shall I say, countries that deal with debts in a sophisticated manner, come from an angle of understanding on not just the economic principles, but to a good degree, the legal principles. I must flag to everyone here that when you decide to be involved in public finance or public sovereign debts, what you have decided to be involved in is a field that tap dances between economics, finance, strictly speaking, and law. It's not enough to just know the economic principles. It's very important to, at least on a very primal level, understand the legal underpinnings that could entrench a solid finance or economic system. And so moving forward, I said there are a few clauses that we need to explore, and tomorrow is going to be a packed day because we're discussing loan documentation negotiation, and that is going to be a powerful session, I imagine. The point being, we're going to unpack all of the various, these clauses you're seeing on the screen and even more. We're going to look at how to negotiate them. And again, as I've said, this is not a session just for lawyers. It is for everyone that determines to interact with debts or with sovereign debts. And so one of the things to look out for in a bond indenture or loan agreement, even as a non-lawyer, is just check the governing law clause. What law is governing this agreement? Obviously, your creditors and your lenders are very likely to insist that it is UK or English and Wales law or New York law. And the reason is not far-flung. The first reason is because these are jurisdictions that are globally acclaimed and they are familiar with. But the second reason, and probably the more important reason, is because they can easily enforce in these jurisdictions. And they try to escape what we now call in sovereign debt restructuring the Greece effects. And the Greece effect really was what happened in 2014, where Greece, in restructuring its debts, because a good chunk of those debts were governed by local law, passed a new law that effectively compelled its creditors to restructure, its old holdout creditors to restructure those debts. And so creditors that were not willing to be engaged in the restructuring perimeter were compelled and drawn into the restructuring perimeter by that law. And Greece sent a very strong precedent to the markets. And so today, hardly would you find a sophisticated lender that is willing to come into an agreement with your government under domestic law, except if it is a sympathetic lender to the African cause. Say, for example, one of the African multilateral financial institutions. They may be willing to do debt swaps or currency swaps in your currency because they have a development mandate and a desire to see the continent grow. But when we talk about the bond markets or sophisticated commercial creditors like global banks, it would be a miracle to find one that would agree to govern a loan agreement or a bond indenture under the country's laws. So that's an important clause to look out for. Another clause is dispute resolution, and this ties into the first clause. It's really what forum can be used to determine the dispute if, for any reason, we will run into problems in the dispensation of this loan agreement. Again, what we say is London and New York. Covenants and conditions. This is extremely important. And again, we'll talk about it tomorrow. But the point is, we have covenants like a negative pledge that says you cannot take a security that places a new obligation above and beyond that of existing creditors or lenders. We also have pari passu, that really runs similarly to what a negative pledge seeks to address, except that pari passu is usually for unsecured transactions. We'll come to that again tomorrow. we have events of default, and these are just events that stipulate when would we determine that this government or that a party to this agreement is in default. And when you're in default, that could, or maybe not in default. When can we determine that an event of default has occurred that will lead to a default, which can then become enforceable? All of this we will describe tomorrow. Collective action clauses promulgated by the very great Lee Buchheit and was an aftermath of the Greece restructuring, sought to address the whole issue of retroactively compelling lenders or creditors who do not want to participate in restructuring to come within the restructuring perimeter. Okay. So we've dealt with contractual frameworks, and now we will go to, So I should just mention, by the way, that it's important when you are entering into any loan or bond indenture that you check with your legal departments in the government if there are no laws that prescribe certain terms within that agreement. So just some laws that, for example, say you cannot enter a particular agreement with a sole lender if the exposure of the country relative to GDP is, for instance, 20%. There are laws that can regulate how borrowing is done. And so we've talked about the public laws, the Constitution, the Parliamentarian Acts, and all of those. Sometimes they could contain terms that would determine how certain agreements can be crafted. It's very important to watch out for if the terms in an agreement would violate local laws. And that you can always flag to a creditor to say, we really appreciate and we want to go forward with you, but unfortunately, this is in contravention of our laws. How can we deal forward? Finally, okay, so I think I've been talking for the last 50 minutes, thereabouts? No? Thereabouts? Okay. So we turn to how international players, the IMF, the famous IMF, and the World Bank, and to a good extent also, the African Development Bank, and just generally international organizations influence public debt. So the IMF and the World Bank have guidelines, first issued in 2001, and then revised in 2014, and effectively this guidelines sort of indicates what frameworks should be in place for a public debt management office division. The key principle is that debt management transactions are usually required to have strong legal foundations. As a matter of fact, the IMF guidelines specifically say before debt is incurred, a country or a member country should have strong legal and financial advisory services. So it's recommended. You see, the thing is, when we go to the IMF, oftentimes we are going as when we are in trouble, a lot of times. And then at that point, the IMF is telling you, you must do this, you must implement this, and you don't have much wiggle room. But if you are familiar with some of the policies, oftentimes these policies are actually for the good of the country to a large extent. It's easier for you then to comply with whatever policies they come either under their extended credit facility program or extended or upper credit tranche facility, whatever program they want to put the country on. It's easier then to have a policy that matches up with what they're expecting, with the expectations. One example that I had here noted is, oftentimes you see that when the IMF or the World Bank comes into a country or want to advance finance into a country, they would require strong legal frameworks, strong institutional frameworks. And they will give you, as part of structural benchmarks or even prior actions, things that you have to put in place in order for their program to go through. One good example, for instance, is Ghana. In 2016, under the Extended Credit Facility Program that they entered into, the IMF specifically required that they passed a Public Finance Management Act. And that was when the Ghanaian Public Finance Management Act was passed. And so this just shows you again how regional and international organizations can play a role in shaping public debt management on the continent and, quite frankly, in the world. So also the World Bank, I think I already made this point a bit, but just to buttress the fact that the World Bank in advancing loans to governments would typically, and I can see that the energy in the room is depleting, the law of diminishing returns is taking its course, and that's understandable, but I promise I'm going to round off in a few minutes and allow for questions and engagement. And so the World Bank usually requires, before they advance certain loans, for instance, that a country has the appropriate legal and institutional framework to accommodate the loans. The African Development Bank also, through lots of its programs and policy reforms and recommendations, insists that African countries and its member countries, quite frankly, implement certain institutional and regulatory frameworks. The whole point of this slide is to indicate to you that beyond your public laws and your private law or your private contracts, international organizations have a huge say in how public debt management is framed. I mentioned here that the ALSF, in its own way, as I'm doing now, provides advisory services to African countries on complex debts and has assisted on overall debt management, etc., etc. We have helpful handbooks. We touched on this yesterday, just to show how we also are part of the whole process. The Paris Club and the G20, through their reliefs and initiatives, have also determined how public debt is managed. You will see, for example, during HIPIC and MDRI, those initiatives did not occur in silos. They came, as many of us will remember, with very strong structural adjustment programs that for some countries were just too difficult to implement. So in this way, by implementing their initiatives, they are also coloring how debt is managed in a country. And I just noted here that the current trend, we've talked about this, is debt transparency. It's, quite frankly, it's the way of the world now. If there's any country here that has a suboptimal debt transparency policy in place, is extremely important, because in almost any engagement within this landscape, there's a strong premium being placed on debt transparency. Very important. Voila. Here we are. So, conclusions and key takeaways. You know what? I think it makes sense for us to, because we are done, quite frankly, I think. Let me see. Here's how I will take the rest of the session. Because we have roughly, quite frankly, 30 minutes, I know that we are probably hungry, so it's probably a good time to also close quickly. But I really want us to engage on these issues. Can a representative from South Sudan, because your hands was up earlier, and one from Mali? So please, as I'm calling the countries, kindly take note of your countries. So South Sudan, Mali, Eritrea, Niger. And believe me, I'm just taking names as they come to my head. Guinea. Please, can representatives from these 5 countries let us know what are the key takeaways, excluding the ones on the screen, that you've learned or that stayed with you or that struck a chord in your heart as we've spoken today. I know that the Eritrean stream is seated somewhere there, but I think the first country I called was South Sudan. So can someone please get the mic? Oh, great. There you are.
I was submitting on contingent liability, and I will come back to the takeaway. We were trying to share our experience with our colleagues and with you also, as you said. On the issues of contingent liability.
I'm sorry, please. Just to make it orderly, your point on contingent liabilities will be taken just after this round, This round is just for us to conclude the slides. Then we'll go to your interventions.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yes, our takeaway, generally, we don't have a legal framework when it comes to debt management. We are using public finance management. That's the guiding law which we have now. And our takeaway now is to help us to provide a technical person who can draft a legal framework for the government of South Sudan so that we can follow the procedures which can take us to the rightful way of managing the public debt. That's the takeaway. Another one is the peer learning. Let me respond to contingent liability because I need some help in that area.
Yes, but I'm not taking questions now until this round is done. Okay. I would definitely come back to you. I've noted your concern. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Voilà, bonjour tout le monde. Bon, en ce qui concerne le Mali, bon, il faut reconnaître que nous avons, malgré le contexte qui nous est imposé, nous avons quand même un cadre juridique formel et nous avons une stratégie qui aujourd'hui fait l'objet de mises à jour régulières et partagées avec le Parlement. Donc la stratégie, nous avons une stratégie de dette à moyen terme et cette stratégie accompagne chaque année le projet de loi de finances au Parlement. Donc le seuil d'endettement également, nous y travaillons, même si aujourd'hui le Mali est à un seuil quand même modéré d'endettement de l'ordre de 49,7% sur une norme communautaire de 70%. Donc aujourd'hui, il faut le reconnaître, il y a quelques difficultés avec la crise pour respecter un peu tout ce que nous voulons faire. Mais quand même, le cadre qui est là, c'est un cadre qui réunit plusieurs services, plusieurs parties prenantes. Parce qu'il faut reconnaître que le gestionnaire de la dette chez nous n'est pas intégré au Trésor. Donc c'est une structure qui gère la dette, mais en partenariat avec les services du Trésor. C'est la Direction générale de la dette publique. Donc globalement, nous traitons les questions de dette de manière concertée avec l'implication de plusieurs services et aussi de la Banque centrale des États de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, BCAO, à travers son agence nationale au niveau du Mali. Donc globalement, quand même, ce travail-là est fait chaque année et nous le faisons en partenariat avec le Parlement. Merci.
Thank you. So was there anything in the presentation that you think going forward the governments of Mali or you would take to the government of Mali to implement? In just one sentence.
C'est quand même ce que nous allons recommander, c'est quand même le renforcement des capacités, quand même des équipes, parce que nous avons un cadre légal, donc il y a une commission nationale qui est chargée de ça, et cette commission est stratifiée et in fine, c'est présidé par le ministre de l'économie et des finances. Donc, pour vous dire que ce comité a besoin de renforcement de capacité pour pleinement jouer son rôle, non seulement dans l'analyse de la viabilité de la dette, mais également comment permettre à notre pays quand même de faire face à ce fardeau de la dette. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, and that's helpful. CB is noted. South Sudan mentioned that it would be helpful to have someone who has the technical expertise to assist with undertaking the drafts or the framework for a strong legal and institutional framework. And for both of those, again, the African Legal Support Facility has is here for you effectively to say, if you want, you can send a request about the needs of your country, and we will handle your legal framework, we'll handle your capacity building. I just wanted to underline that important point. I believe the other country I called was Niger. Is it Niger? Is Niger here? No? Oh, yes, great. So again, just to clarify in one breath, what you've learned and you think you can take forward for your country.
Merci, Monsieur le présentateur, de votre exposé. Effectivement, dans ce que vous avez présenté, au Niger, il y a tout un dispositif qui concerne la gestion même de la dette. D'abord, le premier texte, c'est la Constitution. Dans la Constitution, il est bien dit, très clair. C'est le président de la République qui est habilité à autoriser même la signature de l'accord de prêt à travers un avis juridique. Donc, il est très bien dit dans la Constitution. Aujourd'hui, nous avons la charte de la refondation, c'est ça qui est la loi fondamentale. Le même article est repris dans la charte de la refondation, c'est toujours le président. Donc, dans l'ancienne formule, avec la Constitution, dans la Constitution, il est dit très clair par la voie réglementaire. Le président, c'est lui qui a le dernier mot, mais le processus va être fait par la voie réglementaire à travers un décret. Donc, dès que les techniciens font les travaux, il y a des arrêtés qui sont pris, qui cadrent, qui créent le comité avec les missions bien définies et les rôles. Dès qu'il finit, le dossier est monté pour que le président prenne un décret pour renvoyer à la ratification au niveau du Parlement. Aujourd'hui, on n'a pas le Parlement à la forme ancienne, c'est le conseil consultatif qu'on envoie le dossier pour avis. Et une fois tout ce processus est fini, il y a le président qui signe l'avis juridique. C'est ça qui conditionne la mise en vigueur de cet accord de prêt. Donc le besoin qu'on a besoin, c'est un renforcement des capacités des outils d'évaluation et d'analyse de la dette du comité qui font ces travaux-là. Merci.
Unfortunately, we don't have an extra time for your colleagues, but I appreciate that it's important to hear their perspective. But when we get to the Q&A, we can take their comments. I think the last country I called was Eritrea. Please, just 1 minute, Eritrea. What is the key takeaway from this presentation for your country?
I think for Eritrea also, the responsibility of borrowing is very centralized. It's only the Minister of Government that can borrow. Not only that, state governments cannot also borrow without the consent of the central government. As to the purpose of borrowing, it's also clearly stated in our laws we should only borrow for development purposes, not for recurrent expenditure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are you saying that, just to confirm that I understand your point clearly, that state governments or states or subnational governments can borrow without approval or without being in conjunction with the federal?
Yeah, Eritrea is a unitary state. It's not a federal one, but we have regional states,
okay,
as well as municipalities.
Okay.
These are not allowed to borrow without the consultation and the approval of the central government.
That's helpful. And does the central government also include the parliament or just the executive?
No, everything. Everything? Yes.
Okay. That's helpful to note. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, we are now actually on the slide you see on the screen, and for questions and discussions, and if you ask a very difficult question and I cannot answer it, I would answer it later. Okay, so if there's anyone that has any questions, please just signify by raising your hand. And yes, there's someone there from Guinea, so I would just note the countries, and then we can take the mics, we can take the number of hands that we have and just manage time that way. So there's a hand from Guinea. Any other person? We have just one question. Yeah, I really love this class because it means that everyone understands and everything is perfect. Okay, so, and I think the gentleman from South Sudan as well. What country is that? Anyway, there's a hand there, but what's your country, sir, please? I can't see it that far. Gambia, yes, Gambia. And then there's South Sudan for sure. South Sudan will go, okay, the mic is already with Guinea. So after Guinea, South Sudan, because he's wanted to talk about contingent liability. And no one else? So we have 3 questions. There's someone at the back, all the way back there. Please, what's the country so I can note it down? South Sudan also? 2 South Sudan, so just South Sudan.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for this opportunity again. I was to share the experience of South Sudan on contingent liability, though it was not very clear whether they are contingent liability or not. One of them is external and one is domestic. We had a situation where the Ministry of Trade and the Bank of South Sudan made a deal with the traders, and one of the banks, K1B, to be giving traders LC, that's a line of credit. And then in that process, the deal did not go well, and they did not get back the money to the bank. So it bounced back to the Minister of Finance. And then the Minister of Finance was saying, I did not sign, and I did not even guarantee this process. So how comes you bring it to me? So the debate went on until it came to our books as a loan. And when we went for structuring to be a loan, the terms were not very conducive. They were very bad. The maturity period was short and the grace period, and the interest was high. That's the experience we had on contingent. Whether I want you also to help me, whether that's the nature of contingent liability or what does it, how can we call it?
So just to confirm, the agreement was signed between, is it the...
the Ministry of Trade and Industry,
okay,
and the Bank of South Sudan,
yeah,
and K1B, 3 of them.
Okay.
So that's one situation. Another one is the pension. As we are paying salaries, there is a deduction for pension, and that money is not there. Like if one wants to retire today, so there is no money to be paid to that person, and it has accumulated over years. So once the pension commission need to retire some people, they come back to the Ministry of Finance requesting the same amount, and then that thing has accumulated over time, and we have a number of people who want to retire, but we don't have money to pay them. Yeah, these are the situations we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll answer every question as I hear them so I don't forget the details. So first, just to piggyback on what contingent liability entails, it could be either implicit or explicit. It is explicit when the government signs an agreement undertaking an obligation under that agreement or guaranteeing an obligation under an agreement. When a government entity, you have to understand the way South Sudan, please correct me or remind me, what system of government is in place in South Sudan? I know we have, for context, presidential or unitary or republican. What is the system there?
It is a republic.
A republic, yeah. Super. So in that structure of government, and quite frankly, in every structure of government, the Ministry of Trade and all ministries are the government. There is no, by law, the Ministry of Trade is an extension of the executive arm of the government. It is not a separate entity. And so, from that perspective, even if it's the Ministry of Sports that enter into that agreement, the government of Sudan is in that agreement. By implication, the expectation is, so it may be an internal matter to say the Ministry of Finance did not sign, did not approve, did not have wind of this arrangement, and so we will not pay. It's an understandable argument, but only domestically. When it comes to the rights of your creditor, the expectation is that with your creditor, you are acting as a single entity, as a government. The Ministry of Trade is an agent of the Republic of Sudan. They're not acting on their own or in their own capacity, even if someone may have acted beyond his powers, and that's a separate matter to deal with. And so from that perspective, it is a direct, explicit contingent liability. And in simple terms, a contingent liability is a liability that inheres in favor of a government of a country that may not readily become a liability until certain factors or certain circumstances have happened. For example, when the government defaults and the creditor accelerates. And by accelerates, I mean the creditor decides to enforce that default and say, give me my money. From that point, it becomes a liability. But prior to the creditor doing anything about enforcing the loan, it is still contingent. It's contingent on the creditor demanding his pay. So that's what it just means. It's a contingent liability is a liability, except it's one that is hanging until something happens. And what happens? The creditor decides, I want my money back. That circumstance makes that contingent liability become a grounded liability, an actual liability. And so in this case that you've described, it's an explicit contingent liability because the Ministry of Trade is an organ of the government of Sudan. The second question was with regards, I was not able to note that down. Please, if you could kick your mic and remind me again.
Yeah, it was on pension.
Yes, pension. So
yeah.
Pension falls under what we call implicit liabilities.
Okay.
And so whilst explicit liabilities implicates the government expressly because the government has signed a document, implicit liabilities are expectations that land on the government by virtue of their political and economical sovereignty. When people have not been paid their due in a country, after they've retired and served that country, there is an implicit liability on the government to settle them. It is generally recognized in law as one of the ambits of implicit contingent liability. So, yes, the government has to pay. The second question we got was, or the second hand, actually the first hand was from Guinea. So can we please get the microphone to the gentleman in white? Or does he have it? Okay, he has the microphone already.
Merci, je suis Mélia Ismaël Souma de la Guinée-Conakry. Comme la plupart des pays ici présents, nous avons un cadre juridique formel à travers la loi organique relative aux lois de finances et règlements de la gestion budgétaire et de la comptabilité publique. Nous avons également une stratégie de dette à moyen terme. Alors, à travers cette formation, je pense qu'il serait efficace pour nous de renforcer les ressources humaines à travers les outils de négociation et des formations à l'attention des acteurs impliqués dans le processus de négociation. Aussi, sur la question de transparence, il serait important de publier régulièrement des rapports sur la dette publique, détaillant les opérations d'emprunt, la structure de la dette, les coûts associés, et mettre en place un système d'évaluation des risques.
So your question, or your comment was really a comment and perhaps in reaction to the key takeaways, and I've noted the capacity building and the same advice I gave to South Sudan and one other country in front here was that you write a request to the African Legal Support Facility to help with capacity building, and that will be done. I believe there was a question from the Gambia, and that's the final question for this session.
Thank you very much, the presenter. My name is Karamo Jawara from the Gambia. from the presentation, I saw that it is very crucial, in the laws, so clearly elaborate on the debt limits. And this, whether is going to be in the form of overall envelope that the country can carry at any point in time, or this has to define in an annual budget as to, how much new debt the country can add, So, and the audit also is featured there very prominently, debt audit. But now, is this the process of the debt management that is going to be audited, or the value for money? So perhaps, I don't know whether that is usually defined in a clear terms in the debt management law. So I believe that is, and the frequency of it. So these are important to put check, to ensure transparency, and also for us to get the benefit of the debt. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I believe that was a contribution and not a question. And it's duly noted. Or was there a question there that I'm missing? No? No? Great. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time. It's been great to... there's a question at the back. How much? Is that 3 minutes? That last question.
Thank you very much. I'm Justin Joseph Marona from South Sudan Parliament. My question is, we have a case of contractual legal framework. We have a loan from QNB, and then we default, and then our case is taken to competent court in Britain, and later the country paid the loan, and I think it is a bad loan. So now, my question, do you have a mapping of the countries that are facing the same challenges in our countries, transitional countries? So number two, the issue of auditing, as my friend in Gambia is saying, we are having an issue that vested on the political will. Now, how can this institution help us to move this issue into the center so that we address some issues related to auditing, especially auditing of the debts and the other related auditing report? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just to clarify, is the question how the ALSF can help with best practices for auditing your debts?
Yes. For instance, Public Accounts Committee, we want to conduct something like mini conference, collecting all the accountability sector in place. We have 10 states and 3 administrative areas, so that at least the culture of accountability and so on to be inculcated. And therefore, the ALSF as a renowned institution in this, how can they come in order for us to fast track such kind of ideas in order to inculcate this accountability culture and values to our institutions?
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, I will just speak as quickly as I can. There are 2 ways I can think about how we can go about the issue that you've raised, and perhaps we can have a chat after now. But one of the ways is to entrench the culture of accountability. Perhaps it's helpful to first have the understanding or the intellectual basis for understanding why accountability is necessary. And I think when we've gone through the slides, you've seen some of the reasons why we have advanced the need for transparency and for accountability. For example, creditors take stock of this. Credit rating companies take stock of this. It affects how expensive your loans and bonds can be priced at, etc. And maybe what is needed is the capacity building session on debt transparency and accountability more broadly for the department, for the country. Ultimately, it will be important to pass or to provide a framework for what a legal underpinning or undergirding for the country might be and how that can help the country. Because at the legal support facility, we provide legal support. The question of political will is something that has to be dealt with almost internally. I must note, however, that the appropriate framework can help ground and foster this political will. And Jamaica, if I recall correctly, it's a very good example. Jamaica overhauled their economic system, but I think, in fact, there was a political will from the top to say we want to change things. And then the Minister of Finance, for example, was given metrics. One of the metrics, for instance, was you have to reduce our debts from, I think it was 175% to 100%, even though he achieved 77% in that year. And that was one of the metrics that was given by the president to continue to retain the Minister of Finance as the minister. He met it. And Jamaica did a lot of other policies in furtherance of entrenching the right political government or political environments to foster the good debt practices. So the point being made here is ultimately the responsibilities on the government. We can create frameworks, and that is good, that is important, that's the first step, but we also need to entrench the mindsets and the need for public debt governance and accountability. And on that note, I would just make a final point in closing to say public debt is a public responsibility. Whenever we sign loan contracts and bond indentures, we are binding the people of our country to a debt that they must pay, barring restructuring. It's a responsibility we must undertake with sobriety of mind and presence of the right wisdom to undertake that burden. On that note, thanks to everyone, really, for your attention, for your contribution, engagements, and interventions. I would leave you here, but I hope we will continue to engage in remaining sessions in this program. Thanks again.